Okay, I guess I will bore you to death. Really, my earliest memory, I'm sure I've watched wrestling all my life, but really, my earliest memory I have of pro wrestling, and Sean Waltman, if he ever listens to it, which I doubt he will, but hey, if he does, I'm going to plug you, X-Pac. I remember when he was just, I guess, the kid, and that infamous match he had on Monday Night Raw, beating Scott Hall, which he was known as Razor Ramon, and getting the 1-2-3, and then later becoming the 1-2-3 kid. It, I think, is really my earliest memory of pro wrestling. So I guess there's just something about that that made it stick in my head that, and I can remember it to this day that it's been over 20 years ago, and I can still remember that moment like it was yesterday because it was just something that stood out. Because you didn't see in wrestling back then the kind of unknown guy come in and beat the well established star. So I guess it's what made it stand out for me. So I've pretty much watched wrestling my entire life, but that's really my earliest memory. Hey, now I would really only watch WWE or WCW back in the day when Nitro came on. I didn't really go to indie shows or stuff like that. I wasn't really familiar with WWE. Or, yeah, I was familiar with WWE and WCW, but I wasn't really familiar with the Memphis Wrestling or any other territorial wrestling because I guess just back then I had the grandeur. I wanted wrestling.
You had limited exposure.
Yeah, I had limited exposure, but I wanted the grandeur and all that, the production value and stuff like that. So I really didn't seek out any other professional wrestling, and I'll get into how I got into the indie scene and later. But pretty much I've watched wrestling my entire life and watching Raw, and then obviously getting to live through the Monday Night Wars and WCW, going with WWE, and I still remember the night Hulk Hogan walked down in the infamous line of "He's the third man, he's the third man." Hogan getting the ring, dropping the leg drop,
Shock factor.
Yeah, I still remember that. So that's one of my favorite moments in professional wrestling. And so watching wrestling going through that WCW and the Monday Night War, and then WCW. I remember their Nitro from Panama City Beach and that going off the air and kind of remembering melancholy. It's actually in the house that I currently live in, which is where we record. Just a fun factoid. I watching that episode and then just watch Wrestling Evolve and stuff like that. Now, in about 2005, I kind of would wrestle backyard style, which I don't necessarily recommend. My story's a little different from a lot of other people, but I would like backyard wrestle. And when I say backyard wrestle, I didn't backyard wrestle like you would see on TV with like the barbed wire, light bulb, stuff like that. So I would kind of wrestle around with my cousins and stuff like that.
It was much more of a grappling style of thing, was it?
Yeah, more grappling. And like I did what was called obviously the NWO was big, so I did the New Wrestling Organization and then kind of had a dispute about that. So I came up with my cousin the name WHW, World Home Wrestling, because it was kind of wrestling at home was kind of the whole deal. So that's where we came up with the name WHW and the WHW title. And I'd wrestle with my cousins, and then I did that. And then in 2005, I met my friend Shannon Dell, which I was introduced to me through my cousin Larry, which I feuded with a lot, Razor Blade. And from there I met them, and that's where I kind of grew the whole wrestling deal and did more shows and actually started wrestling. We would record our matches, and like a few years later, I'd put them on DVD and stuff. So for us to watch back and stuff like that, just to have something to do. I purposely took a class in college my senior year so I could learn how to video and edit and stuff like that, so I could do stuff like that. And it's during this time.
You do an excellent job even behind the scenes.
Yeah.
I will admit that.
Yeah, and that's where I learned how to do like my video editing, stuff like that. It's just that I've really learned sound editing here recently to do the podcast, which I will get to here in a minute. But it's during my time in college that I met my co-host, Mr. Cornbread Chris Heineken, and I don't even remember, or I know we met at a Taboo Tuesday.
It was the very first Taboo Tuesday pay-per-view.
Yeah, it being
Wings
on
to
a Tuesday.
Go.
I actually, Wings to Go is a local wings place that we have here in Arkansas. It's not a chain, not like Buffalo Wild Wings or anything like that, but we would go and watch it there. I actually would go with my dad because he's really who's responsible for getting me into wrestling. My mom still hates that fact that dad got me into wrestling, but we would go to Wings to Go at my cousin that I was telling you about, my cousin Larry, told me that WWE pay-per-views were being shown at this Wings to Go place, and I pretty well would go up until almost the launch of the WWE Network. They quit doing it, I think, like several months. But, well, no, they actually aired.
It was a year, wasn't it?
Well,
close to a year.
Well, actually, they aired the Elimination Chamber pay-per-view that aired right before the launch of the network, so they were still showing pay-per-views. They actually switched venues, like right before that happening. So, the last one that they aired that I was aware of was the Elimination Chamber right before WrestleMania 30. So I was pretty much going to that. And like I said, I met you back in 2005. Ivan, you kind of would help me with the whole backyard wrestling shows, doing voiceovers and stuff like that. And from there, the jump ahead, 2009, and my friend Shane that I'd met through my cousin Larry had told me about this wrestling promotion in Hoxie and stuff like that. And he said, I've got this friend. He told Mike that you mentioned the boss. I've got this friend that's a loudmouth that would be perfect in bringing me in. So he told me about the show, and that's where you mentioned I invited you to tag along with. And I actually started when I broke in.
Which ended up being a blessing to me.
Yeah. I actually was brought in as a referee. Dear God, did I suck as a referee, and I would be the first one to admit that. So,
but even through those experiences, you learned.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it was good to learn as a referee and stuff, and I mean, just learning on as time went. It's good and a blessing in having guys come in, but I'll continue with the story. I went from being a referee to being a manager or a second, because Shane's relative, David, which went by Dracon, he asked me to manage him because they had a show coming up, I think the next week or a little bit after, we're in Black Rock, so he brought me in as a manager. And I did apparently such a good job that he wanted to bring me back in on a regular basis and be his manager, and that's where I spent a lot of my tenure. Well, being in the backyard and wrestling and stuff like that, I always wanted to be a wrestler. It was never my goal or intention to do anything else. I always wanted to wrestle. I guess I just like the pageantry of wrestling and stuff like that. I don't know if I really like the physicality or stuff like that, but I wanted to start wrestling, so I built my own ring with the help of my uncle and stuff like that. So shout out on the podcast to my uncle. And I started kind of doing self-training and kind of learning stuff like that and getting in the ring and just learning how to wrestle. And I had my first match, which I was okay. I wasn't great. The match wasn't good. So after that, I kind of took some time off from wrestling. And then I think I came back, and I don't remember if I was managing or wrestling again. I think I went back to managing for a little bit. And then I got back into where I could actually wrestle on a full-time basis. So I got into wrestling. And then at the end of, I think, about the end of 2011, and I started having health issues. My legs were going numb during a match, and I was kind of, don't like that. So in 2012, I had what I would say is my last match, and I've not really wrestled since then. I'd love to get back into it. I may or may not do that. I haven't decided yet because I have other health issues, but I won't bore you guys to death. But in that time, I going back to the whole podcast and how this started, I've kind of told the story. I bought a microphone to do voiceovers because you couldn't always be with me to do commentary for the videos and stuff. So I got a microphone, which it's the same thing that we're using to record this podcast, to have you do voiceovers for me. And I just decided one day to do a podcast because I was kind of familiar with podcasting and stuff like that. Way back in 2007, I never really fully understood it and how I could fully utilize it until like 2012. So that's kind of the start of the podcast. And that's really kind of my story of breaking into the business, was just my friend Shane telling me about Hoxie, where you're still at and getting involved like that. So that's kind of really my story of how I got into the business and stuff.